Okay, this is your second set of practice questions from 4-1, fractions, decimals, and percents. The first question says, as a fraction, 3 out of 250. What is that as a decimal, and what is that as a percentage? So the first thing I want to do is I want to get it into an equivalent fraction, and that denominator has to be any of the base 10 numbers that we know. So 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. So if you look at it, you're thinking, can I multiply or divide 250 by anything to get it to be 100, 1,000, 10,000? And I realize pretty quickly that I can get that to an equivalent fraction out of 1,000 without too much effort. I can multiply 250 by 4, and I can multiply 3 by 4. And when I do that, I get an equivalent fraction, which means it's the same value, of 12 out of 1,000. So if I read that as being 12 thousandths, that will allow me to write it as tenths, hundredths, thousandths. 12 has to end in that position. I put my 0 there, and I get the answer 0.012 as a decimal. So 3 out of 250 as a decimal is 0.012. Now if I take that 12 over 1,000, and I have to think of it as a percentage, the only thing I need to do is I need to get that fraction to an equivalent fraction out of 100. Now technically, I suppose I could have started with 3 out of 250 and got it to an equivalent fraction of 100 as well. I could have done that by dividing both top and bottom by 2.5. But I know that this one's an easier fraction to work with to get it to that equivalent fraction out of 100. I simply have to divide it by 10 and divide it by 10. And I get 1.2 out of 100, which is 1.2%. Or another way to write it would be 1 2/10%. Or another way to write it would be 1, in lowest terms, 1/5%. All three of those answers mean the same thing. Okay? So 1.2%, 1 2/10%, and 1 1/5%. Because a fifth is the same thing as 2/10. In the second set of questions, we start with a decimal, 12.75. Now, as this is, all right, I got to write this. This is fraction, this is decimal, this is percent. I got to keep myself organized here. So as a fraction, 12 and 75 hundredths would be 12 and 75 hundredths. Okay, as a fraction. As another fraction, this is a mixed fraction. If I was to write that as an improper fraction, it would be 1,275 out of 100. And that's fairly important that we have it as that improper fraction, because now, since I know percentages are out of 100, that percent is actually 1,275%. Okay? Now for this one, a lot of you probably got that wrong, but you have to think about the number 1 as being 100%, the number 2 as being 200%, the number 12 as being 1,200%, and this decimal part would be an extra 75%, which means you have 1,275%. And the last question gives you 3 3/5%. So 3 3/5%, since 3/5 is equal to 6/10, then 3 3/5% is really the same thing as 3 6/10%. So if I'm thinking about that percentage, which has a fraction in it, in its decimal form, it's really the same thing as 3.6%. Okay, just a little bit more than 3.5%. And that's important because when I go over here and write it as a fraction, since it's a percentage, it's going to be 3.6 out of 100. I don't want to have that decimal in my numerator, so I'm going to multiply just by 10. Because I only need to multiply it by 10 once to get rid of it, so 36. So my answer is 36 thousandths, which if I want to write it down as lowest terms, both have, what do they have as a common factor? I both have 4 as a common factor. That would be 9 over 250 in lowest terms. Right? And then to write it as a decimal, the one fraction between this one, and this one that's going to help me write it as a decimal is this middle one. I'm going to read it as 36 thousandths. And I'm going to write it as tenths, hundredths, thousandths. 36 goes there. With an extra 0, I get 0.036. Okay, if you're still having difficulty with these questions, there's one more video. It's going to be called Fractions, Decimals, and Percents Quiz 3. Just try that one. It's right after this one, and it should help you get a little bit stronger at it.